Welcome to Alt Swift X's ACOK Abridged, a series where we read through the Game of Thrones books. We're up to the second book and the 10th chapter therein. It is called Davos 1. This is the first chapter from the perspective of our favorite Onion Knight, at least in the top 3 of all Onion Knights, Davos Seaworth. It's been a little while. It's been a minute since we did an Alt Swift X Cock Abridged episode, and maybe this is a time to take things back to basics. There was a time around like halfway through the first book of this series when we started doing live streams instead of pre-recorded. Some people liked the talking with the chat and stuff, some people hated it, and I think there's something in the idea that listening to the chat is distracting potentially, so I think this time around I'm mostly gonna ignore the chat and all of your wonderfully helpful comments, and mostly we're just gonna take things back to the streamlined, focused purpose that defined this series. You know, just the complete and utter, just absolute. Oh, we've already got technical difficulties. We will ignore you, lazy Biku. But look, let's just get into it, because this show is not about tangents. This show is not about distraction. This show is about just intense, direct, turgid literary analysis. That's what it's all about. So welcome all, and let's begin. So this chapter, so we're near the start of this book, a Clash of Kings, and this book differs from the first book in that we start with a lot of dark, magical energy. The first book introduced us to the characters, to Johnny Boy and Tyrion and Dany, and the various political conflicts that began, and now we're starting to introduce some of the magical elements and some of these sort of secondary and tertiary kings that are involved, and the whole story starts getting a whole lot more complicated. I think this book is when Game of Thrones really sort of went off the rails, but like in a good way. Because remember, George Martin said that the Song of Ice and Fire was going to be a trilogy. He thought this would be done in 3 books and about 6 years. 5 books and 21 years later, there's still no end in sight. You know, I think like we're only doing episodes about every 6 months. That's been our rate over the last 6 months, but I reckon if we continue at that rate, we've still got a chance of getting this whole series done before The Winds of Winter comes out. But let's not get cynical. Let's continue and start with the first chapter, the first line of this chapter, which is the morning air was dark with the smoke of burning gods. What a line. What a line. This line is imbued, it is saturated, it is soaked with a sense of rising threat, of a threat of cataclysmic, metaphysical change, disruption, eruption is threatened by this. The smoke of burning gods. Remember the Winds of Winter preview chapter called The Forsaken, in which Aeron had a vision of like this throne with the rotting corpses of dead gods, and when Euron was talking about his apotheosis and how he'd become some kind of Lovecraftian king squid, like I think this is sowing those seeds. The smoke of burning gods. This is a time of change and danger and risk and rise and fall and reward, and so and Stannis in this chapter is trying to embrace these eldritch magical powers. So he's hoping that he can use those powers and channel them to sweep Stannis onto the Iron Throne. And spoiler, it's probably not going to work out that way for him, because magic is a difficult thing to control. It's not like one of your canals. What's the canal that cuts across Africa? The Panama Canal. It's not one of your neat little, Venetian canals that you can just, sweep your gondola along. This is a tidal wave of magical energy that's rising and threatening to sweep across Westeros, and it's no easy thing to harness that magical energy without being swept along in a tide of salt and blood. Yeah. Welcome to Alt Swift X. Okay, second line. We're up to the second line. They were all afire now, maid and mother, warrior and smith. So we're listing off the gods of the seven, the Catholicism, the sort of standard popular religion in Game of Thrones, and these gods are burned. Stannis is sacrificing the gods of his people, of his culture, to embrace this foreign god, which doesn't always work out well when you do that. Trust me, I've tried like 3 times. Like in the 60s, I tried out Zoroastrianism, and that was it took weeks to get the stains out. But we have these descriptions of the different gods. The crone has pearl eyes, which is probably because of the cataracts. The crone is very old and elderly, and I suppose that the eyes have started to get a little foggy, as they do. The father has a gilded beard, not a builded beard. And the stranger is carved to look more animal than human. And of course, the stranger is the god of death in the Faith of the Seven. And so I think it's interesting that they look at death as something animal. I mean, think of like how our culture embodies death as like a grim reaper, like death is embodied by as a spooky skeleton, a human form, whereas here the Faith of the Seven is embodying the stranger as an animal form, which has a certain logic to it, because death is something natural. It's something that visits not just humans but all mammals and animals and life forms alike, except for those squids. I mean, those jellyfish. Those jellyfish that are like immortal and they just continue like spawning and cloning themselves and living on forever? That's a thing. Look it up. But death comes for all, except for the jellyfish. Third sentence. So we hear about the old dry wood and the countless layers of paint and varnish that these statues of the seven are formed of. There's like years and years of worship that has gone into these gods, so it's no small thing to burn them. They're almost like trees, aren't they, with their countless layers? If you cut them down, you could probably count the layers and see how old the god is, If you want to know how old a god is, you just open up his mouth and look in the teeth. Count the teeth of the god. But don't look a gift god in the mouth, because then things get complicated. All right, no tangents. So heat rises, shimmering through the chill air, and gargoyles and stone dragons are on the castle walls of Dragonstone. Gargoyles and stone dragons, we were introduced to those in the prologue of this book. Dragonstone is covered in these monstrous gargoyles of lots of different creatures, and the stone dragons, of course, are supposedly going to be awoken into real living dragons at some point as part of the Azor Ahai prophecy, or at least so Melisandre says. So the gargoyles and stone dragons, they represent a sort of dormant magic that Melisandre and Stannis are trying to awake and harness. The book says, as if the beasts were trembling and stirring. So these are powers that they're trying to awake. And it is an ill thing, Allard declares. So Davos Seaworth has several sons. In the books, we only see one of Davos's sons, Mathos Seaworth, but there's also Allard and Dale and all these others. And these guys are not too keen on the whole burning gods thing, and Davos tells them to shut up because well, you don't want to openly criticize when people are starting to get burny, or you might be the next thing that Melisandre decides to burn. Davos says that his sons are good men but young, and they're rash. And Davos feels gratitude towards Stannis, because Stannis Baratheon raised Davos to be a lord, and he raised his sons to be, knights and heirs to a castle, and to give them prospects and prosperity, and that's something that they would never have had without Stannis. Because of course Davos's background is that he was a smuggler, and Davos forgave his smuggling because he delivered onions to save Stannis during the siege, and so he also decided to punish Davos by cutting off some of his fingers. So he rewarded him with lordship, but also took off his fingers. That's Stannis' idea of judgment. And Davos is grateful to the person who cut off his fingers, which is one of those funny sort of twists of feudalism, that this servant who, has to do whatever Stannis says, has gratitude for the man who disfigured him. It's kind of perverse, I think, the way this feudalistic system makes people blindly obedient to people who commit violence against them. That's one of the sort of we'll get into that. So hundreds of people have come to check out the burning of the gods, because you would like there's not a lot of entertainment in medieval times. There's no Netflix. There's not even Napster. These guys have to get their jollies where they can. And when there's a bunch of gods being burned on the beach, you have a beach party. That's the done thing. And the smell in the air is ugly. Yeah, it's hard not to feel uneasy at such an affront to the gods. So Stannis was never good at PR. He was never good at marketing. Stannis is trying to make himself a king who people want to follow, but he's not doing a great job of making himself loved in the way that Renly is, because by the laws of gods and men, Stannis should be the rightful heir to the throne, since he's Robert Baratheon's eldest surviving brother. Renly is the younger brother, but he's just decided that he's cool and pretty enough to be king instead of Stannis. So this shows, if nothing else, the importance of branding. There's a reason why Steve Jobs is, there's a reason why people know Steve Jobs' name and not Wozniak's name, marketing. Morlan in the chat mentions Alt-Shift-X and Alt-Shift-X. Yeah, obviously Alt-Shift-X is the real deal, the real steel, as Donal Noy might say. Alt-Shift-X it ain't shit. He's just inflexible iron, that bloody Alt-Shift-X. What's he done? And yet Alt-Shift-X has all the bloody subscribers. Stunny. What kind of justice is that? What justice is there in a world where Alt-Shift-X has more subscribers than Alt-Shift-X? Alt-Shift-X never did a Super Mario Bros. 3 playthrough. Alt-Shift-X did almost the entirety of Super Mario Bros. 3 in one live stream. Alt-Shift-X hasn't even been in the first level. So by any objective metric, Alt-Shift-X is the superior channel. But yeah, Alt-Shift-X is pretty good too. All right, we're getting distracted. We're still on the first page. Let's power through this. So Melisandre is conducting a ritual to sort of to crown Stannis, to represent, acknowledge, to symbolically make Stannis Azor Ahai, the fulfillment of this prophecy that Stannis will be the great hero and the leader who'll save the world. And Melisandre is sort of artificially recreating that legend, the legend of Azor Ahai, in order to imbue Stannis with this sort of magical symbolic power. And Melisandre walks around the fire, walks around the burning gods 3 times, speaking in 3 different languages. And I think that sort of evokes the 3 attempted forgings of Lightbringer. Because remember that legend that Celador San tells us later about how Azor Ahai, the original hero back in the day, the way he created Lightbringer, the red sword of heroes, is that he first made a sword and put it out in water, and then he made a sword and stabbed a lion, but then finally he made a sword and stabbed his wife. And it was that third try where Azor Ahai was made, the number 3. And so Melisandre walking and talking 3 times here is, I think, meant to evoke or connect to that numerological symbolism, if you will. It's also kind of like the walls of Qarth, if you want to get even more sort of esoteric with the symbolism. In Qarth, there are these 3 walls made of 3 different materials that protect the city of Qarth, just as Melisandre walks 3 times in 3 different languages. Anyway, we're on the 2nd page. Rip, roaring pace. Okay, page 2. Lord of Light, we offer you these false gods. Take them and cast your light upon us. The night is dark and full of terrors. It's interesting that I imagine there's sort of two ways you could play this. Like when you're casting down false gods, when you're trying to displace one religion in favor of your own, as you do. This is practical advice, guys. So listen up. I think that you've sort of got two options. You can either destroy that god and declare that god a false god and just and wipe them out and replace them with your own god, or you can try and sort of subsume and appropriate and assimilate that god and that religion into your own. It's been done. If I was smarter, I'd be able to give you some example. I mean, yeah, there's like pagan stuff. Like people always like to point out that, like, Christmas is a pagan festival that was swallowed by Christianity. Easter was a pagan idea. Oh, look, I haven't got a PhD, but smart people told me this. Point is, it's possible for religions to sort of eat each other. Have you guys ever played? Oh shit, what's that game? Something Agario or what's the game that the YouTubers play where you're like a snake or a worm and you eat other worms and you get a bigger worm, or like you're just a circle and you go around swallowing other circles, and every time it grows bigger. That's kind of what like religion is like, and what like cultural artifacts are like, right? Like when you eat something, you get bigger, and until that you're just this giant monotheistic blob that's swallowed all of culture. Like it's a little bit, yes, Slitherio. That's right, Yolak. That's kind of what culture's doing right now, isn't it? Disney just ate Star Wars and ate Marvel, and soon enough Disney is going to be the giant monopoly that owns all culture. And if you want to tell a story, you got to pay royalties to Walt. It's immensely depressing. Point is, what I was trying to say is that maybe Melisandre could have said, hey, the Faith of the Seven is really just the Lord of Light. I mean, lots of, it's very fashionable now to say that like, hey, all the gods are basically the same. Gods just mean love, gods just mean light, and all the Abrahamic religions and all the other religions are just trying to give a name to good, and that name is God. That's sort of something that people say now, and Melisandre could have done the same, right? Melisandre could have said that, hey, the Faith of the Seven is just the Lord of Light. And by the way, Stannis is, Hugo of the Hill or whatever. Because that's the other thing. There actually is like stuff in the Game of Thrones lore that suggests that there actually are connections between the various religions. So like the sort of the Jesus of the Faith of the Seven is this character Hugo of the Hill. And Hugo of the Hill had these 7 stars that came down from the sky and came down onto Hugo's brow as a crown. Hugo got the fire of the gods came down on high. A star came down from the sky down to earth, which sort of evokes the red comet and like the imagery of the black stone, of the bloodstone emperor, all sorts of theories about moon meteors, which is sort of its whole other thing. But there is evidence in the books of interconnections in the lore, which Melisandre maybe could have taken advantage of if she wanted to use some better PR. But I digress. So Stannis is watching this whole pageantry, this religious ceremony, this thing that's going on, and Stannis watches impassively, his jaw hard as stone. Stannis is always impassive. He's not a man of passions. He's always talked about as having a stone and grinding his teeth, and he doesn't really enjoy anything. He just wants to do his duty, and I suppose his duty. The pumpkin in chat asks, what kind of donation does AltShiftX have? So there's the super chat on YouTube, but that's not very good because YouTube takes like a large chunk of the money. Streamlabs, if you do want to make a stream donation, use the Streamlabs donation, the stream donations link in the description, because that actually gives like 100% or most of the money. So if you do feel like throwing money, use Streamlabs in the link below and don't use super chats. Anyway, so Dragonstone Sept. So we talk about the history of these particular statues of the Faith of the Seven. So specifically, these statues were made from the wood that Aegon the Conqueror had in his ships. When Aegon the Conqueror, 300 years ago, came to conquer Westeros for the Targaryens, he turned the masts of his ships into these statues. So these are 300 years old, and these have a lot of ancient religious significance. I mean, these are priceless historical religious artifacts. It's almost like It's almost like you know how everyone claims to have like fragments of the cross that Jesus was crucified on. Like everyone with a little bit of tan bark is like, hey, this was from the cross of Jesus. And if you got together all of those scraps of wood, you'd have enough to make like 100 crucifixes. But the point is that these chunks of wood that Melisandre and Stannis just burned, they are no ordinary statues. They are important. And he's destroyed them, which is bad marketing. So some of the lords of Westeros, some of the lords of Dragonstone and the surrounding area were unhappy about the destruction of these priceless ancient religious artifacts. Sir Hubert Rampton and 3 of his sons went to try and defend their gods when the Queen's men, when Melisandre's men came and took the statues, but some of the Ramptons were imprisoned, and Lord Gunser Sunglass, the mild and pious Gunser Sunglass, was imprisoned for standing against this whole religious thing. Crow Squared in the chat points out that the Taliban destroyed statues of Buddha in what, Iraq and Syria and those places. Yeah, this is like a real thing that happens in history a lot. People destroy each other's cultural heritage, and it's fucking horrifying. Look up the pictures of the stuff destroyed in Iraq and Syria recently. It's depressing. And just as in real life, some people die to defend their cultural heritage. And Davos thinks about his relationship to the gods. He says that the gods don't really mean much to him. He did sometimes, make offerings to the warrior or to the smith when, he's doing this or that, but he's not a very devout man. I think it's interesting that Song of Ice and Fire does not have many religious point of view characters. Like, really the only person who thinks a lot about religion is like Aeron Damphair, who's like a frothing, deluded fanatic. And, there is also like, Ned Stark, who, prays to the old gods, and, all the Stark kids have a certain amount of old gods flavor going on. But there's not a lot of characters who there aren't a lot of characters who believe in the faith of the Seven in any meaningful way that we get to explore. There isn't much exploration of the faith of the Seven generally. Like, we see all sorts of stuff about the magic of, the old gods, and Muhammad in the chat points out that Victarion is religious with the drowned god. Yeah, I think that's a good point, because he's one of the more moderate sort of. I mean, Victarion's not what you'd call a moderate person, but his belief, he's pretty devout. Anyway, so they talk about the death of Maester Cresson, because remember that in the prologue of this book, Maester Cresson talked against Melisandre and ended up dying from the poison that he tried to kill Melisandre with. And so it looked like Maester Cresson was struck down by the Lord of Light for his impiety, because of course other people didn't know that Cresson was using poison. So I guess kind of ironically, Cresson's attempt to stop Melisandre and the Lord of Light actually kind of helped Melisandre and the Lord of Light, because Cresson's otherwise unexplained death made it look like the Lord of Light had real power, And I think that sort of clues us into the idea that Melisandre uses tricks to demonstrate her power. I mean, it is true that Melisandre magically survived Cresson's poison, and that means something. She did magic there. But the fact that Cresson died was not a religious thing, and yet people interpret it such. So, like, that's consistent with Melisandre's whole approach. She uses a certain amount of, like, falsity and delusion and self-deception in order to make it look like her god is this whole thing, It's complicated. It's like, her glamours, and her illusions, her shadows, her light. It's all sort of about falsity. All of the religion in this series. Anyway, so Davos thinks about how he'd like to kill Melisandre, because he thinks she's such a bad influence, but he thinks, oh well, what chance would I have to kill Melisandre, since Maester Cresson couldn't kill Melisandre, so how could I? And of course I think Davos would be able to kill Melisandre. I mean, he does try later on and fail, but he thinks about, Melisandre as like, untouchable because of how magic she is. But really, like, a good swing of a sword, I'm sure Davos could kill Melisandre. Like, when we see things from her perspective, she's not some omnipotent magical being. She struggles to maintain the amount of magic and illusion that she does. So in a way, people's beliefs about Melisandre are her armor. The fact that people fear Melisandre's power is in itself more powerful than Melisandre's actual power, which is like what Varys says. Power is just a trick on a wall. It's an illusion. And Melisandre is one of the preeminent weavers of those illusions, like Job in Arrested Development. Okay, so Davos was only a smuggler. He's a very humble man. He doesn't think much of his own abilities, even though he does have a great influence in the what happens in Westeros. And Davos thinks that the burning gods cast a pretty light, red and orange and yellow. And Melisandre says that the beauty of the statues will make them more pleasing to R'hllor, which is such a crazy, like perverse view of the world, when you destroy things of value because you believe that the afterlife and the gods have more use for them. It's like how the Egyptians would put all these goods and all this food and money and living slaves. They would lock them all up in their pyramids to give to the dead pharaohs in the afterlife. And it's such a horrible, terrible waste to give beautiful things to the dead. Because, spoiler, the dead don't need them, especially not in a society where there's, slaves. But that's just one of the wild things about belief in it. So we have a description of how this ceremony came to be. So the mother, the statue of the mother, has been stabbed with a longsword, thrust through her heart, the book says, and the sword is alive with flame. So here Melisandre is recreating this myth about Nissa and Azor Ahai, because supposedly the original hero, Azor Ahai, stabbed his beloved wife Nissa with a sword, and that's what made the sword Lightbringer, the sword that saved the world. So she's trying to make Stannis play the role of Azor Ahai. She's sacrificing the gods of the Seven, just as Azor Ahai sacrificed Nissa. And the lords and all the people watch on at this display. And Lord Celtigar coughed into a handkerchief that is embroidered with red crabs, because the people of Westeros do love their sigils. I like how characters from Essos make fun of the Westerosi obsession with their sigils, because it is pretty silly to cover your handkerchief in red crabs, I would think. The last thing you want to blow your nose into is a crab, and trust me, I've tried. And the Lord Valerion has the blood of ancient Valyria. The Valerions have, Valyrian and Targaryen blood in them. Possible that some of them could ride dragons. Meanwhile, Davos Seaworth stinks of fish and onions. So Davos is apart from the other lords. He was common born, and so even though he's like a lord in name, he's not really accepted into the noble class. He feels set apart. But his sons don't have the experience of being common so much as Davos does, so they're a little prouder. And he thinks that maybe one day in the future his sons might get to wed with people like Lord Valerion's children, and his little black ship, his little sigil, might fly as high as the Valyrian seahorse or Celtigar's red crabs. So Davos is hoping that his line and his children will rise up through the system of nobility and become as powerful as some of the others are, which I think is kind of depressing. Like, you know how like in 1984, like, the protagonist learns to love Big Brother. Like, he exists in an oppressive system, and it ends with him embracing that oppressive system instead of, fighting against it. It's like that Black Mirror episode, 1 Million Merits, where the protagonist tries to fight against the oppressive system, but he just ends up being assimilated into it. That's kind of what's happening with Davos. Davos was a common man who was, fucked over by the aristocracy and the feudal system, just like everyone was to whatever extent. But he's just been subsumed into it. He's been made a lord, and he's just towing the line, and he's just being obedient, and his sons are going to become part of the system. So, he was a smuggler, he was a criminal, he was outside the system, but now he's just being swallowed up by the system. And I think there is something incredibly depressing about that. Everything I am, I owe to him, Davos says. He's got this sort of slavish devotion to Stannis, and he admires Stannis for semi good reasons. Stannis is this sort of honest, just man, for all the good that does him. But I still think there's something sad about Davos's extreme loyalty. I also think it's interesting that Davos, as part of being made a lord, he no longer uses his smuggler's skiff, and instead he uses a war galley, which is kind of like that idea of people rise to their level of incompetence. Like they've done like studies on like corporate structure and like offices and stuff, where when someone's good at their job, they get promoted to a different job, and if they're good at that job, they get promoted to a different job, which just means that no one stays in a job that they're good at. They keep moving up until they come to something that they're not good at. And it seems like that's kind of what happened to Davos. Davos was a really good smuggler, so they made him a lord, and it remains to be seen if Davos is that much of a good lord. Davos thinks about his family. He's got a wife called Maya, who's the mistress of a small keep on Cape Wrath. It's a little bit sad that in the end of Game of Thrones, the TV show, Davos never went back to his wife. Davos stayed in King's Landing. Davos doesn't talk about his wife very much in the show, but in the books, he does love her. And it's a nice little home that he's got in a place called Cape Wrath, and there's a nice little keep where Maya lives, and there are woods where they can hunt deer, and there's this whole sort of nostalgia for home. It would be nice to see Davos returning home. And Stannis thinks about how loyal he is to Davos thinks of how loyal he is to Stannis, and he thinks a lot about luck, which is interesting. Davos doesn't rely much on the gods, but he does think a lot about luck, because in a little leather pouch around his neck, he keeps his finger bones that were cut off by Stannis. His fingers are his luck, he thinks, and he needs luck. And indeed, Davos does have some pretty good luck in the end, because in the Battle of the Blackwater, when everything blows the fuck up, Davos survives, and he's saved from shipwreck. So maybe Davos's luck, there is something in that. Dark smoke rises from the burning gods, and this is of course on the beach. So what we see here is smoke and salt, just like in the prophecy of Azor Ahai being born amidst smoke and salt. So Melisandre is, I think, consciously recreating the prophecy as though that's how it works, as though you get a prediction of the future and therefore you try to make that prediction come true. Maybe that's how all prophecies work. Prophecies don't come true because they are legitimate visions of the future. They come true because people try to make them true, So Melisandre is robed in scarlet satin and blood velvet. Her eyes are red, and there's that great ruby glistening at her throat. So in the TV show, we had this revelation that Melisandre is hundreds of years old, and that the ruby at her throat is artificially making her look younger. I wonder if that's true of the books. Melisandre does use glamour magic to disguise Mance Rayder as the Lord of Bones. Maybe Melisandre is disguising herself in the books as well. And so Melisandre states part of the prophecy of Azor Ahai. She says, "There will come a day when the stars bleed, and a warrior shall draw from the fire a burning sword." The bleeding star could be the red comet that we've seen at the start of this book, and the warrior burning from the fire, drawing from the fire a burning sword. And combining that with the idea of Azor Ahai and Nissa, this could definitely connect with the idea of Jon Snow stabbing Daenerys Targaryen, right? Like, people for a very long time have wondered if Jon might have to sacrifice Daenerys to become Azor Ahai and to get the sword Lightbringer, just like Azor Ahai and Nissa. And the show did not do that exactly. We didn't really get Lightbringer. We didn't really get Azor Ahai in the TV show. But Jon did stab Daenerys, and I don't think that's something that the show made up for their own purposes. So maybe it's possible that in the books, Jon will sacrifice Daenerys before the defeat of the White Walkers, and there'll be some kind of magic and prophecy happening in the books. Or maybe something a bit different will happen. Maybe Jon will execute Melisandre, and that Melisandre's fire will go into the sword, or something like that. There's a lot of possibilities. And Melisandre declares Stannis Azor Ahai. And yeah, spoiler, that probably won't work out. Stannis strides forward like a soldier marching into battle, which is really how he approaches everything. Stannis is joyless. He is dutiful. He does everything not because he wants to, but because he feels that he has to, which is not strictly true, is it? Like Stannis doesn't have to make himself like fight his war to win the Iron Throne. He doesn't have to, draw Lightbringer from the fire. He could just take a boat down to Narth and have a party with the butterflies or something. I think that people who tell themselves that they have to do this and they have to do that, I mean, there are some things you have to do to survive, I suppose. But I think that mentality of saying that, this is my duty, I'm obligated to do this or that, I think it sometimes comes out of a fear of having to take responsibility for your own freedom and choices. Like, it's scary to have to choose between lots of different things, and it can be less scary to think that, well, I've only got one option. I have to do X because that person said so, or that obligation exists, or that person expects that of that. And I think sometimes you can have this revelation of realizing that, these responsibilities and obligations, they're only really as real as I believe in them. And there are plenty of obligations to choose from, right? Depending on who you listen to. You can follow, family or nation or religion or work or all sorts of different things. And I think when you realize that none of those, that all of those influences are arbitrary, you realize you have a freedom to do what you want. And that can be terrifying, because when you have freedom, the consequences of your decision are yours. When you're just doing what you have to do, when you're just following your duty and following your obligations, it's not really your fault what the outcomes of your actions are, right? Because you can just accept that, I had to do that, so that was the only outcome possible. Freedom is scary because you have to choose and you have to accept the consequences of your actions. And, that's an extended, unnecessary psychoanalysis of Stannis Baratheon. Tune in next time for our favorite segment, unnecessary psychoanalysis of Stannis Baratheon. And Stannis has a long padded glove when he reaches and draws the burning sword from the fire. And they put a cloak around him to, keep the flames off. And later they have to, pad off some of the burning embers from his clothes. And I think what this sort of raises is the idea that, it's all well and good to have a legend about gods and fire and the burning blood and the waving sword, but when you actually think about the practical, pragmatic requirements of something like a burning sword, you have to think that hang on, that's not very practical. A burning sword would set things on fire. It would be very hot. It would be a tad warm on your fingies. Thinking about the practical ramifications of all this prophecy and magic, what does it actually look like? To draw a burning sword from the fire. What does it really look like to drive back the darkness with the light? It's going to be really interesting in the final books to see what the reality look like. Will it be fantastical and cartoonish, or will it be gritty and grimy and bloody and awkward? It's not just dark, it's awkward to do this magic stuff, conquering Old Town with a giant squid, as Euron seems to be wanting to do. What does that actually look like? Probably just awkward and difficult and inconvenient, so all fantasy is sort of riding that line, I think, of romanticizing and fantasizing versus reality and just realism and pragmatism. And the king plunges into the fire with his teeth clenched. Which is also how he had sex with Melisandre when he does that later on. He plunges into the fire with his teeth clenched. And I'm not just being crude here. The whole stabbing the sword into Nissa with the fire, that absolutely is symbolically connected to sex. The idea of penetrating something and damaging something, I mean, that's symbolically loaded. But the point of committing that kind of an act in order to create something new. You only birth something new through a violent process. There's a violence in sex that Martin's trying to evoke here, and that's where power comes from in this sort of symbolism. When Stannis has sex with Melisandre to birth the Shadow Baby, when Azor Ahai stabs Nissa Nissa to birth Lightbringer, when Rhaegar kills Lyanna Stark to birth Jon Snow. Like, it's that same sort of symbolic pattern over and over. When the Bloodstone Emperor kills the Amethyst Empress to create, the Long Night or whatever, like there's all this repetition which you can interpret in lots of different ways. Anyway, and Stannis draws the sword from the fire with a single hard jerk. Which was my nickname in grade school, actually. And there are jade green flames, and there's cherry red steel, and this is a very colorful, evocative description of the magic. A sword of fire, shouts Queen Selyse, and all the Queen's men take up the cry. A sword of fire, it burns, a sword of fire. It's almost like a Greek chorus. Do you think that Selyse and the Queen's men rehearsed this pageant before it happened? Do you think they said, all right, so Stannis is going to pour the sword out, then you guys are going to shout, the sword, Azor Ahai? Because let me tell you, these things don't always work out organically. When you try and have an entirely spontaneous religious ceremony, communion wine gets spilled, naked virgins get twist their ankles. It's a whole disaster. You've really got to think about blocking. You've got to think about stagecraft when you're conducting this sort of a ceremony. Cults ain't easy, friends. And Melisandre says, a sign was promised, and now a sign is seen. Behold, Azor Ahai. And the word promised, connects the terminology of Azor Ahai to the terminology of the prince that was promised. There is controversy in amongst the fandom about, how connected are the concepts of Azor Ahai and the prince that was promised. Because Melisandre uses both the terms Azor Ahai and the prince that was promised to describe Stannis and the smoke and the salt and so on. So it seems as though the prophecies are, if not the same, at least closely related. But there are some people who dispute that. I think they're two different sort of cultural windows on the same idea, basically. Stannis sort of sets himself on fire a little bit, so he has to deal with that. So, again, there are sort of practical issues with magic. And Davos thinks about, is this whole burning gods thing a good idea? And the gods on the pyre are scarcely recognizable anymore. The head falls off the smith, and there's something like sad and pathetic and wrong. It's like corpses after some war crime, some massacre, some atrocity. They have destroyed something on the beach this morning, and the flames of the sword are dwindling and dying because Stannis put it out in the beach. So what have they even gained from this sacrifice? Have they really gained power? Is this really Lightbringer? Is Stannis really Azor Ahai? Spoiler, probably not. Davos thinks that the Red Sword of Heroes looks a proper mess. So Davos thinks about how he needs Stannis, because Stannis was the one who made Davos a lord. Stannis is Davos's patron, and if Stannis goes down, so does Davos's power, and importantly, so does Davos's son's power and positions. So Davos is not loyal to Stannis only out of being happy about it. He has self-interested reasons to being loyal to Stannis, because if Stannis falls, so does he, and so does his sons. He's trying to secure the legacy and the safety of his family. Hassan Wilson in the chat says that the defacing of false gods is hardly a crime, which is an interesting statement. Like, is it wrong to insult a god if a god doesn't exist? I think the answer is that, the people who care about that god are gonna have a hard time if you destroy their god. But obviously, to what extent people have rights to defend their gods is, how far do those rights go is a real and difficult conversation, I suppose. But if you're only worried about defacing false gods, every god is going to be defaced by someone, because I don't know if y'all are aware, but there is some disagreement in religious circles over which gods are the false ones and which ones aren't. I know, actually. I've got a cheat sheet. I could tell you right now which gods are real and which ones aren't, but it's not going to make anyone happy if I told you. So there are the Queensmen and there are the not Queensmen. The Queensmen are the people who support Selyse and Melisandre. They believe they have openly supported the Lord of Light and R'hllor, and they've gained a certain amount of political power by doing so, by cozying up to Queen Selyse. And other people are less loyal to Selyse and Melisandre. And the sons of Davos chat with him, and the sons again express that they're not so sure about all this R'hllor stuff. And Dale suggests that Davos should be more proud of his lordship. He's encouraging him to be more assertive about his power. But Davos says, nah, we shouldn't question Stannis. We just do his bidding. We are obedient. So there's sort of this intergenerational thing going on between Davos's sons, who are a bit more bolshy than he is. And they talk about the names of the various ships, because after the ceremony is over, Davos goes down to the docks and checks out some of the ships, and everyone shuffles off to go about their day. And there's this interesting symbolism. Like, Davos thinks Davos's sigil, House Seaworth, has a black ship and a onion on it, because that references the smuggling ship where Davos smuggled onions into Storm's End during that siege. And to Davos, the tall black ship represents like the pride and the power of House Seaworth, while the onion represents the humility and their roots as like small folk. And Davos thinks that, his sons, they see the tall black ship, but they don't see the onion. They're not humble enough. And they talk about the port, and they mention how on this island of Dragonstone there are no prostitutes. There are soldiers looking for prostitutes, but they don't find any because Stannis permits no whores on his island. And you could do a whole other psychoanalytic little tangent about Stannis' attitudes towards sex. Spoiler, when you see sex as an obligation, it's not a lot of fun. Well, that depends, actually. It depends on your perspective. But look, they talk about the names of all the different ships. There's a ship called Fury, and Lord Stefan, and Stag of the Sea, and Pride of Driftmark, and Redclaw, and Swordfish, and Black Betha, and Wraith, and Lady Maya. These are the sorts of things that get cut from the Game of Thrones show. And I don't begrudge this particular omission. That's omission, not emission. We're not talking about Baelor Breakwind here. Man, that's a deep cut reference. Anyway, so there are all these different ship names, and Davos has a thirst, so he goes to the local bar, and there's a gargoyle outside, a very waist high eroded gargoyle where you can barely see the features, and Davos is an old friend with this gargoyle, so he pats the gargoyle's head for luck. And the gargoyle is waist high, and he pats his head for luck, which sort of connects to that idea of rubbing a dwarf's head. Rubbing a dwarf's head is lucky, which they do in Game of Thrones Season 5 with Tyrion, which is kind of funny. Why are short people lucky? I don't know. Maybe it's something to do with the children of the forest. And Salador Saan is an old friend of Davos. He's a pirate, a Lyseni pirate, and he's known for his flamboyance. He wears ridiculous rich clothes. He's got daggered sleeves that pull nice time. This guy reminds me of like Hedonism Bot from Futurama. He basically seems to exist to have a good time. God burning episode that just happened. He doesn't regret missing that particular ceremony, because he says that back on Lys, there's a great temple to R'hllor where the Red Priests are always burning this and burning that, and he's bored by it. I mean, I tell you see one eldritch burning ceremony, you've seen them all. So Davos is not too interested in all of that. And he just talks about his ships, and he says, "Hey, have some grapes, Davos. Eat some grapes. They're delicious." And I think these grapes are a lot like Renly's peach. There's a chapter later on where Renly tries to get his brother to eat a peach because he's like, "Hey, this shit's delicious. Life is fun. Like, smell the roses, have a good time, bang the night of flowers. Like, there are joys to be had in this world, brother. Like get into it. Because Stannis is not someone who knows how to enjoy life. And Salador-san is similar. He's someone who knows how to enjoy life, and he's trying to get Davos to stop and smell the grapes or eat the roses or whatever you prefer. And Davos says, "No, I'm not here for grapes. I need ale and I need news, in that order." And Salador-san's like, nah, slow down. He who hurries through life hurries to his grave. Which, is not always true. I mean, if you eat too many grapes, you can diabetes your way right into the grave. So I'd say that, a moderate speed is what you want when you're walking towards the grave. You want to amble to the grave, just you at a decent pace. You don't want to, not glacial. Anyway, so Salador relates to Davos that Tyrion Lannister, the dwarf, has been sent to see to King's Landing, and he got rid of Janos Slynt, and he replaced him with this new tough guy, what's his name, Bywater, whoever it is, to rule the Gold Cloaks, to lead the Gold Cloaks. And it's always funny seeing, an outsider's perspective on things that are going on in other storylines. Because people often have a twisted or inaccurate perspective on what's going on in other parts of Westeros. And a serving girl or waitress walks through the bar, swatting at the hands that grope her as she passes. And Salador-san talks about how he hopes that when they conquer King's Landing for Stannis, he hopes that Stannis will make a gift of the beautiful Queen Cersei to warm his bed. So this is illustrating how terrible this society is for women. Rape and sexual harassment is just part of the deal in this feudalistic society. And it's also a bad world for dwarfs, because Salador-san says that, hey, when we conquer King's Landing, we can make Tyrion dance for our entertainment, and we can make him sing a song, and he's a silly fucking dwarf. So we're seeing, Davos as a common man is often a window through which we see, the inequalities and the shittiness of this feudalistic society. There's a long list of classes of people who have a shitty time in various ways, and women and dwarfs are among them. So Salador talks about the war, and he's pretty eager to attack King's Landing because he reckons he can win, and he's in it for the gold, of course. He's a pirate. He's fighting for Stannis, not out of loyalty, but for money. And he's not getting paid in advance. He's getting paid after the fact, which he's not too happy with. He's only getting promises. It is gold that Salador craves, not words on papers. And of course, Salador in the book still hasn't been paid. As of the 5th book, Stannis' attack on King's Landing has failed. He went up to the wall, and Salador ultimately fucks off because he thought he wasn't going to get his money, which is a real shame. It sort of parallels Bronn's storyline in Game of Thrones Season 8. Bronn does get paid handsomely in the end. I wonder if Salador-san will ever get paid, because he loses a bunch of his fleet, so... But yeah, Davos promises, you will have your gold. No man in the Seven Kingdoms is more honorable than Stannis Baratheon. And Davos reflects that the world is twisted beyond hope when low-born smugglers must vouch for the honor of kings. So that speaks to just the fundamental dysfunction and corruption of this feudalistic system. Because as it turns out, being a king doesn't really mean all that much necessarily. And being lowborn, the lowborn are sometimes more honest and real and reliable than the kings. So that just speaks to how fucked up this society is. Why should there be people who are more, privileged and empowered than everyone else if they are, in practice, no greater than the small folk? Hey, guys, maybe you should invent this thing called human rights and equality. That'd be cool. Just a suggestion. So they talk about whether they could take over King's Landing. Salador is confident. Davos is a bit doubtful. One of the issues is that Stannis' younger brother, Renly, has decided that he wants to be king, and everyone's a bit confused by the situation, what with Renly being a king, and Stannis being a king, and Joffrey being a king, and Robb being a king. It's a little bit like in Game of Thrones Season 8, Episode 1, when people were like, hey, who's in charge here? Queen Daenerys, or Lady Sansa, or King Jon? What the fuck's going on? That kind of instability creates a bit of political cognitive dissonance, and it's dangerous. So, yes, so many kings, my tongue grows weary of the word, Salador says. And Renly is bringing his wife Marjorie to war. Salador speculates that maybe Renly is loath to part with his, quote, warm burrow between her thighs. Of course, we know the truth that Renly is less interested in Marjorie's warm burrow and rather more interested in Loras's warm burrow. Gods forgive me. And Salador doesn't like Stannis because Stannis is always frowning at Salador because, of course, Salador is this hedonist and Stannis is this dutiful, ascetic. Stannis doesn't like fun. And Salador does, so they don't get along. And Salador wonders if Stannis would like him better if he wore hair shirts and never smiled. And Salador says an interesting thing, I am an honest man. He must suffer me in silk and samite. And that's kind of like a funny similarity between Salador and Stannis, because one of Stannis's things, like he says later, that I'll only speak the truth. I won't say that Robert is my beloved brother because I don't love him. It's a lie. I won't lie. And here Salador is kind of saying the same thing. Salador's not going to wear a hair shirt and never smile. He's going to wear silks and samites because he's honest about who he is, and who he is a flamboyant, hedonistic guy. So, even though Salador and Stannis are opposites, they have a similarity in that they are unashamedly committed to expressing who they are. Salador is honest and upfront about his hedonism. Stannis is honest and upfront about his whatever. Glidus in the chat says that Salador should say, "That's not me," because that's what Arya does in season 8 and season 1 and every fucking episode of the Game of Thrones TV show. That's not me. I'm not a lady. I'm a tomboy. Arya is honest and upfront about her identity. At least she is, after she throws off the fakery and the illusion of the faceless men and their whole dehumanizing, depersonalizing thing. But that's another tangent. So Salador-san, the pirate, the liar, the banker, the lord of the narrow sea, he is an honest man. And this honest man tells another truth. He says that sword was not Lightbringer. That whole charade that Melisandre and Stannis just did, the whole ceremony to make Stannis Azor Ahai, it's not real, because that sword was not Lightbringer. And Salador tells the story of the real Lightbringer, the real magic, and how it came to be. And so he tells the story about how Azor Ahai, the original hero, thousands of years ago, during the first long night, presumably, he forged Lightbringer, and he made a sword, and he worked for days and nights, and then he tempered the steel in water, and then the sword broke. And then he made another sword, and he worked for 50 days and 50 nights, and he made this great sword, and he stabbed it in a lion, and he tempered the sword in the red heart of a beast, but the sword shattered. And then finally, he made a third sword, and he tempered it in the heart of the woman he loved. He killed his wife Nissa, and she gave a cry of anguish and ecstasy that left a crack across the face of the moon, and her strength and her courage and her soul went into the sword, and that is how Lightbringer was made, and the world was saved. So there's a lot to unpack there. Symbolically. I mean, the basic point that Salador is saying is that making Lightbringer, making magic and prophecy for real, it involves terrible sacrifice, it involves death, it involves blood, it's fucked up. So be glad that's not the real Lightbringer, because fire burns and too much light can hurt the eyes. Real magic has a cost. And one of the interpretations you can make of what this story of the three temperings means is that, hey, maybe the three attempts is repeated by Rhaegar Targaryen. Rhaegar Targaryen made several attempts to create Azor Ahai, or Lightbringer. He first believed that he himself was Azor Ahai. But Rhaegar ended up dying in the waters of the Trident when he was broken by Robert Baratheon. He shattered in water, just like the first sword of Azor Ahai. Rhaegar later believed that, not after his death, but after he believed that he was Azor Ahai, Rhaegar believed that his son Aegon was Azor Ahai. But Aegon, young Griff, well, not young Griff, but the son of Rhaegar, Aegon, ended up getting killed by House Lannister, by, Gregor Clegane technically, but under the orders of Tywin Lannister, just like the second sword shatters in the heart of a lion, like the Lannister lion. And then third, Rhaegar Targaryen thought that some other kid is Azor Ahai, possibly, because when Rhaegar ran off with Lyanna, it seemed as though he was trying to fulfill the prophecy of Azor Ahai. There must be one more, he said. So maybe Jon Snow is this third attempt of creating Azor Ahai. When Rhaegar thrust his sword penis into Lyanna Stark, that sex created Jon Snow, and maybe Jon Snow is the real Azor Ahai, or the real Lightbringer, perhaps more rightly. And so maybe that's what this whole three temperings means. There's a lot of different possible interpretations of that. I think that's probably the most plausible one. It may be that there's no direct parallel to what the three temperings mean. But there is another aspect to this story that I think is important, and that's that Nissa Nissa's cry of anguish left a crack across the face of the moon, and that crack in the moon is connected to the creation of Lightbringer and the fire of Lightbringer. And that connects to the story of how dragons were born. That's related in the first book and in the first season. It's said, I think it was one of the handmaidens, Dorea said that a trader in Karth told her that that one day there were two moons in the sky. Originally there were two moons, but then the moon wandered too close to the fire of the sun, and then it cracked, and then the dragons and the fiery dragons emerged from the cracked moon. And that idea of fire emerging from a cracked moon is echoed in Nissa Nissa leaving a crack in the moon and birthing the fiery Lightbringer. So that's this whole thing. Go check out some of Lucifer Means Lightbringer's analysis to learn more about some of that stuff. But that's this other sort of repeating thing, like this destructive or penetrative or sexual act creating this fiery energy at great cost. And maybe that's something that'll be replicated when Jon Snow perhaps kills Daenerys, and stuff in the World of Ice and Fire world book talking about how the Loy seems to be playing the role of a Bloodstone Emperor, and how he ushers in darkness by making great sacrifice. And maybe that's sort of what Azor Ahai is about. Fire burns, Salador says. Maybe Azor Ahai and Lightbringer are dangerous and bad. Depends on perspective. It's probably a bit of good and a bit of bad. So Davos says that King Stannis is my god, which is an interesting sort of a god to have. Pretty demanding god is King Stannis. And then we get a food description. Minced lamb and pepper and roasted gull with mushrooms and fennel and onion, because every Game of Thrones chapter has to have a food description. And we talk about how Salador San says that, hey, those gods of the Faith of the Seven, they should have just been given to me because they were too beautiful to burn. I could have sold them or something. So Salador San is irreverent and selfish. And Davos Seaworth thinks about Thoros of Myr, who used to wield a flaming sword in tourneys. And he thinks about how there was no magic in that sword. It was just covered in wildfire. So Thoros is that illustrates how magic is sometimes not real. A true sword of fire, that would be a wonder to behold, and yet at such a cost. So they're emphasizing over and over the idea that magic and prophecy, it comes out of sacrifice and terrible cost. And Davos thinks about his own wife, Maya, and how she's the best woman in the world, and how he would be unable to sacrifice her. If that's the price of a magic sword, it's more than he cares to pay. And so this like explicit idea of Davos thinking, hey, I wouldn't want to sacrifice my wife, that does sort of lend some weight to the idea of, hey, maybe Jon will have to sacrifice his beloved Daenerys for magical reasons. And yeah, Davos just thinks luck when he pats the gargoyle's head on the way out of the bar. And then Devon, Davos' son Devon comes along and says he needs to go and meet with Stannis, and he's worried that Stannis is going to want to sail on King's Landing because Davos isn't so sure that they would win. He thinks there is no hope of victory because their navy, their soldiers are just too few. And on his way up to the up to the castle. Axel Florent, one of the most preeminent of the Queen's men, chats with Davos, and he has coarse hair that sprouts from his ears, but that does not stop him from hearing most of what happens in the castle. And Axel says some pious things about the Lord of Light, and Davos is sort of non-committal. And Axel says that R'hllor sometimes permits his faithful servants to glimpse the future in flames. And Axel says that I saw dancers and fiery fire dancing around, and I think that's going to be the victory that Stannis gets after we attack King's Landing. And Davos says, I only saw fire. And that itself is kind of a premonition of what does end up happening at the Blackwater, which is Tyrion blowing up Stannis' navy in fire. Patchface also has some sort of visions of fire in the future, which could definitely connect to the defeat on the Blackwater. And they go into the painted table room in Dragonstone, and Stannis tells Davos to read some stuff, but Davos is illiterate. He can't read because Shireen hasn't told him yet. And Stannis's brows are furrowed with irritation. Stannis is all furrows. His furrows all the way down is Stannis. And Stannis has written a letter. And he sent the letters all over Westeros, and he says that Joffrey, Tommen, and Myrcella are abominations born of incest. They are not really Robert Baratheon's children, they are actually Jaime and Cersei's children, and therefore Stannis lays claim on the Iron Throne. And Stannis notes that Jaime, even though he is an incestuous king killer, he is a knight. So call him Sir Jaime. Whatever else the man may be, he remains a knight. And also, don't call Robert my beloved brother, because I don't love him. It's a lie. Take it out. And so, this is not only Stannis being sort of like, rigid and honest, it's also Stannis being very resentful. Stannis is very, very disgruntled and frustrated and resentful about all the things he feels were deprived of him, such as, being sent to Dragonstone instead of Storm's End. Stannis isn't just doing things out of duty. He also kind of hates everyone because he feels mistreated. So Stannis is not simply, going by the book. He has a lot of feelings that are driving him. And so Stannis is sending this letter about the incest, hundreds of letters all over the realm, because this is what you did before Twitter. Before you had the Twitter bird, you had to use your raven birds to send the letters around. And Maximiliano in the chat says that it would have been a lot more helpful for Stannis to have done this before Ned was killed in revealing this secret. And true, if Stannis had collaborated with Ned, book one might have gone very differently, eh? So Stannis complains that, all the lords love Joffrey or Renly or Robb. They don't love me, even though I am the rightful king. And, of course, maybe if Stannis had better PR and worded his letters more carefully and didn't burn everyone's favorite gods, then, maybe more people would support Stannis. But it also illustrates, the failure of the feudalistic system, right? Because Stannis is legally the rightful king of Westeros, but everyone ignores that because of, PR. So the system doesn't work terribly well, does it? Cough, cough, Electoral College. Cough. Anyway, so they talk about the ships, and they say that Stannis is going to deliver a whole bunch of letters all over Westeros, because again, like no Twitter, you got to do things analog. So they're delivering these letters, and they're going to nail them to the doors of every Septon Inn at every town for every man to read. And Davos points out that, well, a lot of people can't read, so sending these letters everywhere doesn't really help. So Stannis says, all right, we're going to get a whole bunch of knights to go and read the letters at the inns and the septs and the temples. So, it's just, isn't it just fucking crazy that, like, right now I'm talking to 150 people live on a global, interconnected, instantaneous information superhighway? Like, that is so much easier than what Stannis has to go through just to get one pissy little tweet out about a little bit of incest. It's wild, isn't it? Because, of course, in our age, truth and information is just so much easier to get out, and everyone's so enlightened and unified and happy, and just social media, it's just made everything better. Anyway, and yeah, these are just the sorts of logistics that only the books bother to get into. The show does not talk about all these issues. Maximiliano in the chat suggests that these letters could contain like a stick figure drawing of Cersei and Jaime fucking. Yeah, because that's a thing. Like, if people can't read, maybe they should just try using pictograms. You know, there's a really good SCP for those who are familiar with the SCP Foundation about a monster that can only be communicated in pictograms. Words are too dangerous to use, so you have to use images. People forget the importance of pictures. They say 1,000 words every picture, you know? And I think a cartoon of Jaime and Cersei having sex, that would say 1,000,000 words. Anyway, so yeah, they are literally sending 100 knights to go to the towns and inns and to read these letters because people can't read. It's crazy. And Stannis even suggests that if you run out of letters to distribute, capture a few septons and force them to copy out more letters. Isn't that crazy? Like, man, human rights, what a trip. Like, the idea that in this feudalistic system you can just capture a septon and force him to just copy out more letters, as though he's just a machine, right? As though he's a servitor. Just turn human bodies into tools to be used. That's what Tywin Lannister said, right? Every person is a tool that you can use for a purpose. It's dehumanizing. This system dehumanizes people and turns them into machines. It is not good to turn men into machines. It's not good to turn people into machines. And so they tell the Maester to get to his writing. Maester Pylos is going to have to write hundreds of letters, and they're spreading the word of Cersei's infamy and of Stannis' claim. And then the Maester leaves, and Stannis sits down for some real talk with Davos, and Davos complains about the death of Cresson, and he's like, Cresson was a good guy, he was a wise guy, like, it's fucked up that he died. And Stannis is like, it's not my fault that Cresson is dead, I didn't want him dead, I hoped that he'd get a few more years of comfort. And he grinds his teeth. And it's just so sad that, like, you know, in the prologue of this book, like, we saw from Cresson's perspective how deeply Cresson loved Stannis and the other Baratheon brothers. Cresson pained for paragraphs and paragraphs over how important Stannis was to him, and yet, you know, Stannis barely gives a sentence to mourn poor Cresson, and it's just so sad that Stannis doesn't appreciate Cresson more. But Davos tries to acknowledge his wisdom and his importance, and Lord Celtigar said that Stannis' letter was admirable, but Stannis snorts and says that if I showed Celtigar the contents of my privy, he would declare that admirable as well. The lords just bob their heads up and down like a flock of geese. So Stannis is, you know, even the people who support Stannis is dismissive of everybody. Stannis just hates everyone. Stannis doesn't like anyone. Not his wife, not his people, not his lords. Stannis is a very inward-facing person. He's a very unpleasant guy. The others take my lords, Stannis says, and they may well, because some of Stannis' lords are up on the wall at this point. Maybe the others will take Stannis' lords. Maximiliano says that Stannis likes Davos a little bit. Yeah, that's true. But I mean, you know, only begrudgingly sometimes. Stannis does imprison Davos in a few chapters, you know, so it's Stannis' affection comes with strings attached. But I guess that's how it goes with kings, isn't it? This series is kind of about that, if nothing else. The idea that kings have complicated obligations and subtleties when it comes to their relationships. And Stannis says that his words are true, but Davos says that they are blunt and strong, and you have no proof. So, like, even though Stannis is spreading the truth isn't really worth all that much in this world. And Stannis says that, well, you know, there is one thing that might work as proof of my claim about the Lannister incest, and that's Robert Baratheon's bastard, Edric Storm, because Edric is a Baratheon bastard, and he has black hair. The seed is strong, as Jon Arryn probably mentioned to Stannis at some point. And the fact that Edric Storm has black hair and the Lannister bastards do not is another hint that the Lannisters are indeed bastards. But again, Davos points out that, well, you know, even if Edric Storm's black hair shows that the seed is strong, people can't see Edric Storm because we can't attach photos to tweets yet. And so again, that sort of informational logistical problem comes up. They can't just fax a picture of Edric Storm to everybody. It is a difficulty, Stannis thinks. And Davos expresses concern about this whole Lord of Light thing that's included in the letter. He doesn't think that Reloric religion is going to help Stannis' claim. And so they start to talk about, why is Stannis turning to Relor? Why is Stannis turning to Melisandre? If Stannis is all about truth and duty, why is he abandoning his gods, and why is he turning to this weird prophecy and shit? That seems very un-Stannis-y, doesn't it? And they sort of blather on about that for a while, and they talk. And Stannis says that, look, I don't believe in the gods of the Seven anymore, because the gods and the storm, they destroyed the ship that my parents were on. Because Stannis, when he was young, he watched from his window as his family died. His parents died in a shipwreck. And so that's that good old-fashioned problem of evil that philosophers have paned over for millennia. The idea that, if the gods are all-powerful and the gods are good, why do the gods allow bad things to happen? Stannis decided that, well, the gods allowed something bad to happen, so I'm not going to worship the gods. People say that justice and goodness comes from the gods, but all the justice and goodness he sees is made by men. So he believes that good comes from human actions, not from divine intervention. And so he doesn't even really believe in Relor. He just figures that Melisandre does seem to have some kind of power. Like, even if Melisandre doesn't have magic power, she has the power to inspire fear in people. She can influence people. And so for purely pragmatic reasons, Stannis is just saying, hey, I'm going to stick with Melisandre because she's going to help me win my throne, whether or not her gods are real. Stannis is taking a very atheistic, sort of utilitarian, pragmatic view when it comes to religion. So she's a sorceress who can inspire dread in men, and perhaps she can do even more than that. And so then Stannis tells the story of a bird he had, an injured goshawk that he nursed to health, and he called her Proudwing. But she was not a very impressive bird. She didn't fly very high. Meanwhile, Stannis' brother Robert had a falcon, a gerfalcon called Thunderclap. Which was named after his farts. That's not funny. And so they had these two different birds, and Stannis was trying to be loyal to his bird, Proudwing, but Proudwing was just not that much of a good bird. And Stannis says that, look, I should have tried a different bird. Fuck Proudwing. Just because Proudwing was, mine and my family, just because I was connected to Proudwing, wasn't working for me, so I need to try something else. And so Melisandre says that now I have another hawk. Now I have a red hawk. I never got any love. I never got anything good from my old strategies. I never got anything good from Proudwing, my old hawk. I'm trying something different. I'm trying something magical. I'm trying something dangerous. He's taking a risk. He's taking a leap of faith. I mean, not really faith, but he's doing something different and dangerous to try and win the throne, because that's how you get shit done for real in the real world, right? You need to take risks. Of course, that's also how you fail miserably. The worst things happen to people who take risks and stick their neck out, but also the greatest things happen to people who stick their neck out. So Stannis is rolling the dice loaded with eldritch, magical, fiery power, and spoiler, it'll probably come up Snake Eyes. And Euron, he's also rolling those dice. Euron is also trying to connect to magical powers, and Bran is being imbued with magic, and Jon is going to be imbued with magic, and Daenerys is full of Targaryen dragony power. So A Clash of Kings is introducing all these magical forces. Game of Thrones was just introducing sort of the politics and the characters. This book is starting to inject a real chonker, a real hefty hypodermic syringe is being injected right into the jugular, full of potent magic juice. And that is chapter 11 of A Clash of Kings. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of ACOK Abridged. It's been a while. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I think this is kind of how we want to run it. I didn't pay too much attention to the live stream, and I think that, might be for the best. I think this was the sort of hashtag quality content that y'all go for. So it was 6 months since the last episode, and I dare say it's going to be less than 6 months until the next one. We will do more of this, and remember, there is a podcast feed for ACOK Abridged, so go click the link in the description, go and subscribe to the Alt Shift X podcast. That's where you can get all of the future and past episodes of ACOK Abridged. Thank you all for joining in. What other housekeeping is there to say? Subscribe and like and press the buttons, but most of all, thank you for participating, and we're gonna have more content coming up in the future. Cheers. Eat your veggies. G'day, Cata, Glidus, Halos Oyster. Thank you all for joining in. See you next time.